And hello, welcome back to the show where we talk about Wuxia, Xianxia, and all of the above. Today, I get to talk to the translator of Monarch of Evernight. I haven't read this novel before, so you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to read this novel just a little bit before I get to sit down and talk to Legion. It might not go up tonight. We're probably going to put up tomorrow because, you know, sometimes it's best to not do them live and edit some stuff out, figure it out. But we'll be talking to him at midnight, which is 3 p.m. his time. But for now, I just wanted to have you all join me for a reading of chapters 1 through 5. I will preface again that I have not read this novel before. I haven't checked this novel out too much because I knew I was going to be doing a reading. And I think that the best questions are asked without much knowledge of the novel, just a cursory knowledge. And then once the novel ends, then it's like one of those things where, okay, sit down with the translator and really dive deep, as was the case with Deathblade with I Shall See Like Heavens, and as was the case with when I talked about Desolate Era. So I'm excited. It's the first Xianxia novel that I'm going to be reading that has gunfights in it. Obviously, Upgrade Specialist in Another Realm has he turns like his chi into bullets and shoots them. It's not really a spoiler, but in this one, it's straight up like one of the selling points of the novel. So without further ado, check it out. We got it here on WuxiaWorld, which is the place that I usually like to go. WuxiaWorld and ValaireNovels.com. My favorite places to read this stuff. I'm not a fan of Chidian at all. Yeah, just at all. I'll just leave it at that. Obviously, if translators from Chidian want to do an episode, I'll check out some of their stuff though, because I'm not gonna like go against the people who are doing this for their either their hobby or their life career because of the website they're associated with. But I'm just not really a fan of reading there. So Monarch of Evernight is a novel here on WuxiaWorld. It's translated by Legion. I will give my disclaimer that I always do, which is I am not a native Chinese speaker. I do not speak Chinese or Mandarin. I'm not the best pronunciation, but I try. I give it the 1-2 shot to try. So the quick description we have here on the website is Xianxia rose from hardship but was felled by betrayal. From then, one man, one gun. He tread the path between Evernight and Daybreak and became a legend. Even if Evernight was destined to be his fate, he still intends to become the ruler who dictates. And we have a prologue, so this will technically be chapter 1 plus the prologue. So I'm giving you a deal here, guys. Cool. So prologue of Monarch of Evernight. 1,200 years have passed since the War of Daybreak. That was a war of fate, a collision between humans and the dark races. It was a struggle of Daybreak origin power, burning black stones, gushing steam, rumbling firearms, and enormous rough machinery against darkness origin power. That was an era that truly belonged to the strong. And here we go. We are on board with Chapter 1. Chapter 1 is entitled Crimson Colored Night. Chapter 1, Crimson Colored Night, Volume 1, Between Daybreak and Evernight. The title of Volume 1 is Between Daybreak and Evernight, just so anyone listening knows. And here we go. The Evernight continent was usually shrouded in twilight. This was especially true during the dark season when the upper continent's orbit blocked out the sunlight, resulting in only a few hours of daytime. Tonight, the star Gemini Alpha had shifted to a low orbit. It was a night where the seldomly seen moon was visible. An enormous round moon filled nearly half the sky, seemingly ready to crash down at any moment. Even ordinary people without powers could clearly see the enormous basins and imposing mountain ranges on the moon's surface. Yet the people who had not fallen asleep were anxious. The moon was actually scarlet, and the moonlight, which cascaded down onto the ground like chiffon, spread across the uneven and rugged land like a living animal. Stretches of dark silhouettes were saturated a rich red, causing them to resemble numerous colossal scars and wounds. Above, the cold sheen of metal even occasionally flickered. The howling of wolves and roaring of unknown beasts occasionally traveled over from afar, echoing back and forth, filling the area with an air of savagery. In the legends of the Evernight continent, the crimson moon was considered an ill omen. Furthermore, it was a very rare occurrence, but whenever it appeared, suffering and chaos would soon follow. Whenever the moon became thoroughly saturated with the color of blood, the great monarchs of the dark world would open the doors to calamity, unleashing violence and disaster onto the land below. These legends were not without basis. Under the blood-colored moonlight, all living creatures would indeed involuntarily become even more violent, bloodthirsty, and prone to fighting. Under the scarlet curtain of the night, a small black dot suddenly appeared in the horizon. It slowly moved horizontally across the sky, growing in size with each passing moment as it flew ever so closer. Surprisingly, it was actually a floating airship which was thousands of meters long. The airship looked extremely worn out. Its enormous aerostatic balloon was riddled with patches. Its metal components were completely stained with rust, and many of its interconnecting joints stuck out, causing any observers to wonder whether or not it would suddenly snap. As though confirming their worries, the airship suddenly jolted a few times. Numerous components even crumbled and fell, of which included a large metal component reaching over 10 meters in size. It plunged toward the ground, causing an explosive rumble on impact. The airship began to struggle with difficulty in midair as all of the copper tubings lined up along the outside of the ship began to vibrate. Large puffs of steam also soon started spraying out from within the ship's rear mechanical cabin. The sound of rusty parts creaking could be heard as the 8 groups of propellers situated on top of the ship's hull began to madly spin. Only then did the ship's body somehow manage to stabilize. Several tens of thick cables hung disheveled from the bottom of the airship, carrying a huge cargo bay which was just as rusted and stained as the ship itself. Through the loosely shut cabin door, one could see that the cargo bay was filled to the brim with garbage. Like an enormous drowsy beast, the old corroded airship arduously moved through the last length of its course before finally arriving at its destination. On the ground several hundred meters below, shockingly lay an extremely vast airship cemetery. At that moment, tens of thousands of people flocked out from their respective hiding places. They had long since discarded their fear of the Scarlet Moon. Instead, they began waving their hands at the floating airship as they shouted words of celebration. Even though they lived on this land which had almost been forgotten by the Empire and were the insects of the lowest rung in the entire world, they still struggled and tried to survive through each day. This land was the burial ground of those once splendid colossi. Moreover, as the scrapped airships discarded by the upper layer continents generally carried large amounts of trash with them, as time passed, this burial ground had turned into a junkyard which contained all kinds of things. The survival of these people who resided within this airship burial ground was completely reliant on the garbage tossed down from the upper continents. If no airships transported garbage for a long period of time, a large number of people here would starve to death. To them, the upper continent's trash was their entire livelihood. As for tomorrow, to them, tomorrow was too luxurious of a phrase. In this place, no one would bother thinking about tomorrow. The airship, which had finally reached its preset coordinates, painfully moaned as one by one the propellers came to a stop. At this time, the ship's enormous body fiercely jolted and then began to bounce up and down in midair, losing several dozen meters in elevation. Afterwards, the ship's outer shell near the left frontal side split apart, releasing a small-sized airship. The small airship looked to be much cleaner on the surface. It flew around the junkyard once and then turned around and ascended, slowly flying toward the distant horizon. Meanwhile, now that the airship had lost its propulsion, it started to vibrate non-stop. All of a sudden, it tilted askew and slowly fell to the ground below. Falling ever faster, it finally crashed into the ground and broke into pieces amidst the explosive rumble. A sea of garbage, waste material, and metal components scattered in all directions, calling down a rain of trash from the airship's cemetery skies. The carnival had begun. Shouting and shrieking, the dwellers charged toward the wreckage. Some even ran on all fours like wild beasts. From time to time, enormous metal parts would rain down from above. Many who had just happened to be there where the parts landed were unable to dodge in time, ending up thoroughly crushed into lumps of meat by the several-ton components. However, their companions beside them ignored the dangers and still charged forth as though their lives depended on it, scrambling to start searching for garbage just a moment sooner. There were men, women, and even elderly and children. But age and sex had no meaning in this place. Each group differed according to body size and strength. That was the only standard by which territory was allocated in the cemetery. Of those who were rushing to the airship's remains, the strongest and most robust of men were at the forefront. Behind them, it was the weaker men and strong women. Then the weaker women, and the very back consisted of the young and elderly. Just like that, with the fallen airship as the center, the people composed various concentric circles. Between each layer there lay a formless yet uncrossable boundary. On the outermost edge of the various concentric circles was the area where small children moved about. Hundreds of children unceasingly rummaged through the trash in this area, searching for almost non-existent foodstuffs. Within them there was a thin and small boy who was also searching with great effort. He was approximately 7 or 8 years old, and his little face was so blackened that his original appearance couldn't be made out. The clothes on his body should have originally been an adult shirt, and it was just like a robe wrapped up on him. Moreover, the shirt was already tattered beyond recognition. Now, simply a few larger rags wrapped around his body in strips. He exerted all his strength digging apart the ice-cold trash within his hands covered in cuts. Some cuts were even turning into ulcers. However, it was as though he could not feel pain as he pushed apart the large, indistinguishable pile of trash in front of him with all his might. It has already been 3 days since he has last eaten. If he could not find anything to eat today, then he definitely wouldn't last until the next time the airship arrives. But no matter how hard the little boy tried, he found nothing. This region had already been rummaged through countless times by others, and only then was it left aside for these children who were younger than 10. These children were the weakest beings in this garbage field. When the strong ended unable to find food, their hungry gazes would fall on the elderly and children. This was the abandoned land, the airship cemetery. The people here only wished to live on and were already no different from wild beasts. Even strong beasts live with more dignity than them. The thirst for survival pushed the boy on. He unceasingly searched, and many of his previous wounds tore open once again due to his excessive strength as his blood leaked out. However, he was completely unaware. Another wave of garbage fell from the skies. Within this wave, a relatively large trash bag fell beside the boy. The bag's outer layer broke, and a wax paper bag rolled out amidst various useless garbage, firmly grasping all of the boy's gaze in an instant. That wax paper bag had actually had grease seeping from it. He suddenly pounced over with the agility of a feral cat, tightly grasping the bag within his hands. He didn't open it at all to confirm the contents inside, and instead hid it at once within his clothes. At the same time, he looked around with extreme caution, then cautiously and prudently crawled toward the outer edges of the junkyard. Competition, robbery, and even murder also existed among these children. The degree of cruelty was by no means inferior compared to the world of adults. The little boy was very petite and was classified as a relatively weaker amongst those within the area of this junkyard. If others discovered that he found edible things and wished to keep it to himself by the strong, bigger kids, then being viciously beaten up was the most favorable outcome. Quite fortunately, the boy evaded being detected by all the older children and successfully escaped from this area. He seemed to possess an inherent keen sense and was always one step ahead in avoiding those older kids who were even more terrifying than vicious beasts. After leaving the airship remains behind, the boy madly ran without rest until reaching the backside of another mountain of trash and made his way into an empty iron barrel. This place was his little nest, his shelter against the elements and hardships. In his mind, this small space, just over 1 square meter, was the utopia of life. He carefully took out the wax paper bag and held his breath. With a facial expression full of faith, as if playing pilgrim, he slowly opened it. It was actually a piece of bread inside the bag. A piece of bread that had only been bitten into once. The boy knew at first glance that this thing was called bread. He had never seen a piece of food so intact, yet he completely couldn't recall where and when he learned about such a thing like bread. Actually, that was just an ordinary bread roll. Even the lowest peasants on the upper continent might toss it away after one bite, just like this piece on the young boy's hands. Yet in this junkyard, it could be worth a few lives. Moving a little closer, he could smell the faint scent belonging to cereal grains. The little boy felt that all the wounds and pain on his body had disappeared without a trace. He very carefully held up this piece of bread, finding it difficult to believe that he could actually find such a treasure. Was this a dream? A drop of blood seeped out from the wound on his hand and rolled off onto the bread. The boy involuntarily cried out and hastily wiped his hands on his body with force, drying up all the blood and sweat. When he turned around and looked at his piece of bread while weeping, he felt so horrible as though the sacred object in his heart had been defiled. All of a sudden, the boy's stomach started growling at this moment. It expressed his desire with acute pains as though it was cramping up. So he pulled off the chunk of bread that was stained with blood, rallied up all of determination, and just was about to put it in his mouth, but his hands froze midair. Just outside of the iron barrel, at some point in time, a little girl had appeared. She appeared to be only 4 or 5, and streaks of ash and dirt covered her little face, entirely drowning out her original skin color. However, those clear and distinct features hinted at the immature form of a girl who would be absolutely gorgeous in the future. Her pair of twinkling large eyes were exceptionally beautiful and flowing with the spirit as they fixedly stared at the bread within the boy's hands, unable to turn away at all. The young boy sat up with a jolt while his left hand securely grabbed an iron rod that seemed to have been freshly sharpened. This was the most instinctual response of people who have lived within the junkyard. When one spoon was seized by another, it was often a fight to the death. The little girl did not run away. However, both of her eyes were still glued onto the bread, completely unmoving. The young boy slowly put down the iron rod in his hand. Hesitating, he made his mind up after a great deal of time. He slowly tore the bread into 2 halves and passed one to the little girl. The boy's movements were very slow, and his hand was also shaking while sweat was pouring down his head. His stomach and all the wounds on his bodies voiced their dissent with the most intense pangs of pain unimaginable. However, the bread still ended up in the little girl's hand in the end. The little girl seemed to not dare believe her own eyes. She grasped the bread tightly at once and heavily rubbed her eyes. Only then did she confirm that she wasn't dreaming. She immediately stuffed the bread into her mouth with all her might. The half that was even a size bigger than her fist actually vanished into that tiny mouth in just a few bites, perhaps no more than 3 seconds. The little girl finished eating the bread and licked the crumbs on her hands clean. Only then did she lift her eyes and focus her gaze on the young boy's face for the first time. After looking at him attentively for a moment, she then ran away, almost seeming like she took flight. At this moment, the little boy didn't know what he was feeling within his heart. Even more so, he had no idea why he had done such a thing and could only warily sit back down. Perhaps it was due to those pure and clear eyes that touched a certain emotion deep down within the depths of his heart. But what is this strange so-called emotion thing? The little boy leaned on the barrow's walls, carefully ripped off a fingernail piece size of bread, and put it in his mouth. He did not swallow it right away, but instead kept it in his mouth, feeling the sweet taste of grains with the tip of his tongue. Just at this time, the soft and immature voice of a girl suddenly came from outside of his little nest. "He has tasty food on him! You promised to give half to me!" The boy's heart instantly sunk to the depths of despair. He saw several older children standing outside. All right, that was chapter 1. That's a long chapter. Damn, that's savage. So they're all in a junkyard. It's a airship junkyard, basically, for, where they just drop off the airships that are like totally broken down and beaten up. Basically, I feel like the upper limits of society just trash them at a certain point, and when they trash them, you just have some pilot like fly it out to the junkyard, leave it, and then fly back. So this is just a society of really poor people living in a junkyard. So let's move on to chapter 2, which is entitled Standing in Silence. And it's volume 1, Between Daybreak and Evernight. Unsurprisingly, the young boy was dragged out of his little shelter. The remaining half of the bread was not spared either and was put in the hands of the strongest of the older kids. All of the older kids were over 10 years old, and with the leader being already 12. The leader deeply breathed in the aroma of the bread. Without hesitation, he ripped off a large chunk and stuffed it into his mouth. Swallowing it all at once, the other kids swallowed in their envy. A mouthful of bread could not calm the older kid, instead making his eyes bloodshot from fury. "You actually dared to hide food. What about the other half? Where'd you hide it? Not gonna talk? Beat him up!" The young boy was sent to the ground from one kick. Encircling him, a crowd of older kids beat on him with their full strength. The little boy was rolling back and forth as he was beaten into a tattered cloth sack. Panic emerged on the little girl's face as she stealthily shifted 2 steps back. She knew that if the boy said that he gave her the other half of the bread to her, she would most likely be beaten to death right there. It was as though the boy's lips were welded shut, though. He did not speak a word or utter a single moan, but instead bore the beating silently. Finally, the older kids got tired of beating him, and the beating came to a halt. They searched the boy's little den, finding nothing as well. "Looks like he ate the other half," an older kid said, with both envy and hatred. "Cut open his belly. Maybe it can still be found," a tan, skinny kid shouted viciously. The leader brutally kicked the little boy, yelling loudly, "Where did the other half go? If you ate it, then you can go to hell." The little girl's face went ghastly pale in an instant. Yet, contrary to her expectations, the boy did not speak and instead struggled to stand. The boy's mouth moved as if to say something, but no one was able to hear him. The older kids involuntarily edged closer, wanting to hear what he was saying. Suddenly, the boy's left fist flew upward, viciously smashing into an older kid's face. The older kid screamed miserably, staggering backwards while covering his blood-covered face. The boy had secretly grabbed a piece of metal while he was rolling on the ground and getting beaten. It had opened a violent gash on the older kid's face, its sharp edge sticking out from between the boy's fingers. "Beat him! Beat him to death!" the injured kid screamed madly, covering his face. The boy faced them head-on, fighting with everything he had, yet he was quickly knocked down once more. Clenching his teeth tightly, he rolled into a ball to protect his vitals. He never begged for mercy, nor did he utter a groan. The older kids eventually got tired of beating him, and their fists slowed. The older wounded kid still wanted vengeance. However, he yanked the boy up from the ground in a single motion. Just as the older kid was about to speak, the boy suddenly leapt up with energy that seemed to come out of nowhere, headbutting the older kid's already injured face. The older kid's nose broke instantly. He shrieked, again covering his face. The older kids looked at the boy and actually felt a sense of dread welling up from the bottom of their hearts. They had to admit that even they wouldn't be able to withstand such injuries. They didn't know what kind of strength supported the boy standing before them. This time, no order was necessary. They swarmed the boy and knocked him down, viciously beating him again. When they grew tired, the boy unexpectedly moved a little, unsteadily rising to his feet once more. This was an extremely unyielding child. Even if he were going to die, he would do so standing. "Let's kill him," another kid suggested, his voice even trembling somewhat. If the boy wasn't killed, he felt that he'd never be able to sleep easy. No one followed his suggestion, but they still struck the boy down. The older kids, however, were much easier on him this time around. They were instinctively afraid and were also becoming exhausted. Their harvest for today was puny, which meant that their stamina was also limited. If not for their desire to vent the irritation caused by the crimson moon, perhaps they would have left right after snatching the bread. As the older kids stopped one by one, their bodies extremely sore from the act of beating the boy, a tiny figure suddenly appeared by their side. It was the little girl. She made her way through the crowd, struggling to carry a rock that was quite large from her perspective. All of the other kids looked at her in surprise. Her small, beautiful face brimmed with insanity and determination as she struggled to lift the stone high above her head. Then she smashed it down at the boy's head. With a bang, the boy finally stopped moving. A pool of blood spread out from beneath his head. Gasps came from all around the girl. The older kids instinctively shuffled back a few times, moving away from the little girl they could knock over with a single kick. The little girl ran to the stone that had rolled to the side and strained to lift it up. The stone was already stained with blood, which smeared all over the little girl's face and body. When her tiny figure staggered over to the boy, even the leader of the older kids felt a chill in his heart. Then a breeze suddenly drifted through the junkyard, sweeping up paper scraps and dust. The already cold night strangely became icy as everyone who was already searching through the junkyard for food abruptly shuddered. They were unaware that an invisible force field had already covered the entire junkyard. After the chill had passed, a vast majority of the oblivious junkyard denizens immediately went back to searching through the piles of garbage. A few people had felt as if something jumped a few times in their body, but it was such a weak sensation that it just seemed like an illusion. The sensation went away quickly, so they did not think much of it and continued searching for food in order to survive the day. In the meantime, a few just stood there and stared at their hands in astonishment. At some point, their hands had begun to emit a faint light that was exceptionally eye-catching under the curtain of night. Furthermore, it wasn't just their hands. Their entire bodies had begun to shine as a mysterious new power emerged from within them. From a bird's eye view, the shining people in the vast airship graveyard resembled a galaxy that had descended. The little girl's body also glowed, and her strength increased significantly. The emergence of the light did not change the girl's actions, however, and she quickly walked to the boy's side, smashing the stone at his head again. All of the older children were waiting for the moment the boy would be mutilated. Some were anxious, glancing to the side because they subconsciously didn't want to witness such an act. Right at that moment, light suddenly blossomed from the boy's body. A pillar of red light had emerged as well, surging up to over a dozen meters in height. In the night sky, it was a sight that was extremely hard to miss. Several rings of light emerged around the pillar and moved alongside a mysterious route. The heavy stone smashed into the radiant light, bouncing away as if obstructed by a formless power. Such an anomaly shocked all of the older children, who jumped in confusion. A boat that was over a dozen meters long floated through the night sky, sliding across the lower half of the enormous crimson blood moon. The boat was built in an old-fashioned style. There was a mast, a cabin, a deck. Everything was there. The entire body of the boat was painted blue-gray, and a bronze sculpture of a glaring Buddhist warrior was sculpted at the ship's bow. The warrior's face was full of might, and it held a staff with both hands. A pair of wings were mounted on both sides of the flying ship, which also had propellers installed. The speed of the propellers varied. Some were slow and some were fast, working to adjust the ship's orientation. The ship didn't have an air sac and had no propulsion systems that could be seen. It was unclear just how it was able to stay afloat. The airship's body was smooth and elegant. At a glance, it didn't even seem to be very extravagant, but whether it was the joining of the mast to the deck or the engravings on the railings and the side of the boat, everything was done with extremely fine and precise workmanship. It was a modest kind of extravagance. At this point inside the airship, a silver-haired man stood beside the window, overlooking the airship junkyard below. He didn't look too old and actually seemed to be in his prime. His gaze was deep and clear, and his chin was unswerving yet graceful curvature. He wore a black uniform with an upturned collar, which was the standard style of the Empire's military uniform. However, it did not have any insignia or military rank. Only 2 rows of silver buttons embossed with a flaming longsword showed his exceptional status. The silver-haired man simply stood there, and his capability was naturally displayed, sharp and keen like an unsheathed sword. There was also a man in his 50s nearby sitting in the room. He was square-headed and had large ears, a kind, good-natured face, and a midsection that was already growing wider. He was staring intently at the go board before him as the last white piece of warm, high-grade jade could not land onto the board no matter what. The situation on the board was already near the endgame phase. White's pieces, in the shape of a large oriental dragon, were painfully struggling to survive. After a long period of thought, the man finally let out a long sigh and threw the piece onto the board in defeat. "Brother Shitang, it's been 7 years, yet your skill in Go is still as amazing as before." The plump middle-aged man stood up and walked up to the window to stand side by side with the silver-haired man and look downward. Through the ship's window, one could see that every part of this enormous airship graveyard, which covered nearly 100 square kilometers, glimmered with faint lights that resembled stars. The large middle-aged man, however, wasn't very impressed with the sight. "Brother Shitang, you really ought to change this habit of yours. While the art of heaven's mystery is certainly outstanding in the way it awakens and guides an individual's potential and origin power, there's no need to use it on the entire junkyard, right? Unless you already have more origin power than what you know what to do with. If that's the case, why don't you give me a direct bestowal and let me get a pot of your gravy?" With a faint smile, Lin Shitang said, "Brother Tuhao, you are still as straightforward as always. Look at all the people below. All of them possess the potential to cultivate origin power, you know." Yet Gu Tuhao did not agree. "So what? People with potential are a dime a dozen. You specifically came to this damn place to find me, then took a huge detour instead of directly returning to the capital. It can't be that you just want me to witness your mastery of the art of heaven's mystery, can it?" Lin Shitang chuckled and pointed towards the outside through the window. "I'm not that bored. Look there. If we consider the ratio of people who possess the potential to cultivate, the people of this airship junkyard are already no less than the civilian class of the Empire. You also know that when the Empire moved to the upper continent, all of those that moved with it were the houses that possessed the potential to cultivate. Yet after 800 years passed, the ratio of the Empire's civilians who possess the potential to cultivate are even lower than that of the people in this junkyard. It seems as though the people of the Empire have lived their days in luxury for too long." "That may not be the case." Gu Tuhao shook his head. "Having potential is one thing, and the degree to which an individual may cultivate is another. The houses that followed the Empire to the upper continent all had special gifts and talent in a certain aspect. Once they are able to awaken their cultivation potential, they would be able to advance to rank 3 or 4 at the very least. Meanwhile, the people below lack innate talent and are also twisted at heart. Cultivating to the first rank would be already their limit. Yet it is more likely to awaken one potential in the depths of despair, making more with potential appear," Lin Shitang said leisurely. "That is an undeniable truth." Gu Tuhao snorted loudly. "This is the natural selection of thing of yours. It's been so many years now, yet you still have yet to see it proven." "I'm right, so what is there need to prove it? Look at the starry lights below. Those are the lights of our empire's bright heritage and the future hope of humankind. In the past, the ancestor of my house, the House of Lin, also set out from a place like this. After cutting down countless dark races in these 100 years, accumulating merit and earning achievements, they went from the lowest level of the abandoned land to the being considered nobility. Of this generation, I, Lin Shitang, have been entrusted with a heavy burden by His Majesty. Naturally, I should strive to complete my task to the best of my ability until the day I die. As long as it's beneficial to the Empire, I will act without exception. I don't mind a tiny bit of criticism." Gu Tuhao stomped his feet and huffed with rage. "That's a tiny bit of criticism? I knew I couldn't get through to a stubborn guy like you. Ha! Gu Tuhao, must have momentarily gone crazy when I promised you 10 more years of service to the Empire. In any case, I'm only going this time in order to handle some matters that I ought to take care of. Don't count on me for shouldering some great duty. Also, there better not be a shortage of good alcohol or beautiful women." Seeing Lin Shitang merely smile and remain quiet, Gu Tuhao couldn't help but become slightly irritated. Pointing outside the window, he raised his voice slightly. "You see starlight, but I see people in a horrendous state of livelihood. If it weren't for the Empire's abandoning the Evernight continent in the past, how would this place have become the abandoned land? Just look. How could anyone with actual aptitude even show up in this unfortunate place? If there is, then I'd rather believe that I've seen a fucking ghost. Suddenly, right in the direction of his pointing finger, a thin pillar of red light appeared. Even though the light was weak, it was extremely dazzling within the numerous starlight glimmers. Even the splendor of the blood moon that covered both the sky and earth could not obscure it. Gu Tuhao was instantly dumbfounded as he mumbled, Could it be that I really saw a ghost? Whew, all right, chapter 2. That's a doozy, guys. Look at this. These chapters are pretty long. Thanks for everyone who's watching live. I will go ahead and check out and see if anyone's commenting in the live chat. But if not, hey, what's up, Christopher Soon? Thank you for joining us in the live chat. I know you had to leave right away, but I appreciate you, joining me for the reading. Let me drink some water because these are definitely a doozy. Also, it's hard to make up voices for characters. Like, even if I'm half-assing the voices, it's hard to make them up when I don't even know the character's intentions beforehand. Like, I don't know that Gu Tuhao is like an annoying, pestering bad guy, and I didn't know that Lin Shitang was a good guy who's like totally all about like poor people can make it. So please forgive the inconsistencies in the voices. It's hard enough just to do quotes on this and have it make sense. Definitely need water for this, though. Cheers, guys. All right, here we go. Chapter 3. Chapter 3, The Big Shot's Decision. Volume 1, Between Daybreak and Evernight. The wondrous abilities of Lin Shitang's Art of Heaven's Mystery were unfathomably boundless. It could awaken an individual's cultivation potential as one of its effects. Truly outstanding natural talent would often produce unusual phenomenons under its effects. These unusual phenomena were split into 5 grades. For example, the faint glows from the junkyard were merely of the lowest grade, representing that they only had the potential to develop their origin strength. On the other hand, a first-grade talent would emit pillars of light of various colors. On top of that, strange phantasms could orbit the pillars like planets around the sun, hinting at a person that would be revered by all. Furthermore, the phantasms that appeared also represented the future path of the individual's natural talent. A second-grade talent would only have pillars of light and no phantasms. A third-grade talent would have a single blazing light that resembled a roaring flame, and a fourth-grade talent would just have a bright light without any such phenomena. There were rumors that above the first grade, super-grade talent existed. Those that possessed it would truly be great geniuses of overflowing talent, and the phenomena that would occur could be a vivid representation of rolling hills and roaring rivers, or possibly lifelike images of mythical beasts and birds. Under the cover of darkness, the pillar of light was red and belonged to the lowest rating of the first-grade talent. In spite of this, among the Empire's countless cultivators, a first-grade talent was 1 in 100,000. The appearance of a first-grade talent was well worth the Empire's careful nurturing, so that it would become a future pillar of support for the military. This red pillar of light was like a slap to the face that made Gu Tuhao's face tingle. Let's go and take a look. Without waiting for the airship to change course, Lin Shitang stepped out of the cabin and leapt from the airship, falling from an altitude several hundred meters high. 10 odd, fully armored bodyguards rushed to follow suit, leaping from the airship in pursuit of Lin Shitang. In comparison, Gu Tuhao slapped the window blinds in frustration, but ultimately followed them down. The sight of the sudden change on the little boy had clearly startled the older children, but the little girl had only been disoriented for a moment. After discovering that her strength had significantly increased, she bounded toward an even larger rock and strained to drag it over. The boy was in a daze. With a groan, he turned over. Suddenly, there was a pair of thick suede military boots beside him. The boots themselves didn't actually touch the ground, instead floating a few centimeters in the air above it. An invisible force field quietly spread, pushing all the dust, dirt, and rubbish into the distance. The startled girl stopped in her tracks, staring at the silver-haired man that had appeared without warning. Opening her large, innocent eyes, wearing an equally harmless, childlike expression, she quickly threw away the rock that she had in her hands. Although she hadn't noticed, light was shining from her body through her clothes. The sweat which had originally soaked her palms had completely evaporated, yet the silver-haired man didn't even so much as glance at her out of the corner of his eye. Lin Shitang frowned as he looked at the scars and injuries all over the boy. The boy was clearly more injured than he had first assessed, as some of the injuries seemed to have reached his vitals. With a wave of his hand, a fog of light appeared in the air. A rain of green droplets fell from it and onto the boy, soaking into his body. These green These green raindrops contained an immense power, and the boy's injuries healed at a clearly visible rate. He groaned, slowly opening his eyes as he regained consciousness. The first thing that the little boy saw and registered was the silver-haired man's stern, determined face. The boy didn't understand what was happening, but he instinctively refused to grovel lying on the floor, and once again struggled to stand. Looking around him, he saw the older children and immediately remembered what had happened, his expression changing in an instant. Lin Shitong followed the boy's gaze, looking at the older children surrounding them and the remains of a paper bag on the ground. He instantly understood why the boy was injured to such a degree. This was, after all, a thing that happened in the junkyard so often that it couldn't be any more common. Lin Shitong refocused himself, then crouched down, extending his hand to the boy as he said gently, "Come, give me your hand. What's your name?" But the little boy recoiled a little, and with great difficulty he mustered his courage. "Xianxia," he said softly. His small hand reached out but stopped halfway. He didn't dare to reach any further. His tiny hands were horribly dirty, all covered in grime. Although his wounds had been nourished by the rain of light and weren't bleeding anymore, the crusted bloodstains were still there. In any case, he didn't dare to put his hands on the large, spotless hands of the silver-haired man. Yet at this moment, in the eyes of little Xianxia, the big hands that were already held out in front of him were the only source of warmth in the world. Lin Shitong smiled and encouraged him. "It's fine. Give me your hand." Gu Tuhao flew down at this point. Upon seeing that Xianxia had been injured, the usual kind expression he gave others was somewhat angry. He couldn't help but give a deep snort, coldly looking over at the surrounding kids. The crowd of slowly gathering children had terrified expressions on their faces, but the 10-odd bodyguards had already locked down every single path through this area. They didn't dare to try flee. Lin Shitong leaned over a little, extending his hands and waiting patiently. Under Lin Shitong's bright gaze, Xianxia finally found his courage and placed his hands into the warm, dry, and strong hands of Lin Shitong. Lin Shitong lightly grasped the hands that were half the size of his own, closing his eyes and quietly feeling them. Gu Tuhao looked at Xianxia, his brow suddenly furrowing as if he had thought of something. Lin Shitong sighed and opened his eyes. He gave Xianxia a once-over, reached out his hand to pull away the scraps of cloth on the little boy, and his eyes were instantly captivated. There was an enormous scar on Xianxia's bare chest, one that ran from half an inch below his heart all the way to his belly button. Just looking at this ugly protruding scar, Lin Shitong knew that it had originally been a terrifying injury that tore Xianxia's insides open. But Xianxia was still so young. How in the world had he survived? Momentarily startled, Lin Shitong regained his composure, saying, "Brother Tuhao, you're far more skilled in medicine than I am. Help me examine him." Gu Tuhao silently walked up to Xianxia, not caring about the dirt at all, and he stretched out his hands to carefully examine Xianxia. Xianxia felt that everywhere Gu Tuhao's hands went was like having red-hot needles stabbed into his body, but he clenched his teeth and forced himself not to make a sound. Gu Tuhao's eyes flashed with momentary shock, and he praised Xianxia, saying, "So tender in age, and yet so daring. Interesting." He stood up and spoke to Lin Shitong. "This child would originally be considered a top-tier talent, but he's been so heavily injured that it's ruined his physique. Aside from that, I also suspect that his body might have even contained a piece of crystallized origin power." Lin Shitong immediately thought of a forbidden phrase, origin power theft. He narrowed his eyes a little and pretended not to understand. "So what you're saying is..." "No, it's just a suspicion. Even if you know that sort of thing is a major taboo, his injuries have already been healed for a decent number of years, so he must have been younger than the age of 3 when he was injured. Yet as you can see now, his foundation has been heavily damaged. Even his cultivation potential is greater than anyone here. He isn't a first-grade talent anymore," Gu Tuhao said gravely. Xianxia's old injury was extremely serious, yet he was still able to release a red light pillar. This signified that his original talent was so great that it might have even been super grade, but with his current state, it would be a stretch to even list him as 4th grade. A 4th grade talent would only be slightly stronger than an ordinary person. For Lin Shitong and Gu Tuhao, who were high-ranking officers in the Empire's military, it was practically worthless. On top of that, Xianxia's giant scar was a hidden danger, and whether he'd survive the tough training was something they couldn't be sure of. Gu Tuhao sighed, feeling great sympathy for the boy. Lin Shitong looked at Xianxia, who stared back at him. Perhaps the warmth in Lin Shitong's palm hadn't completely dissipated, but the boy's little eyes held a glimmer of hope that even he had not noticed. Lin Shitong's heart trembled slightly, and he gently said, "Meeting here should be considered a kind of fate. Tell you what, I'll take you away from here and you'll decide for yourself where to go next." He took out a few smooth jade tablets, and with a quick rub of his hand, he engraved words onto them. He held them with the engraved side facing downward, then handed them to Xianxia to choose from. Xianxia hesitated a little, then reached out for the jade tablet in the middle. There were 2 words on it, but he didn't recognize them. Gu Tuhao looked and then sighed, shaking his head. Yellow Spring. Lin Shitang softly read the words to Xianxia before taking the jade tablet back. He patted the boy's head lightly and asked, "What's your surname?" I don't have a surname. My name is Xianxia." Lin Shitang nodded as he spoke gently. "All right. If you make it out of that place alive, then you may use Lin as my surname." Xianxia didn't understand what Lin Shitang was saying and could only continue to listen in ignorance. Lin Shitang didn't need him to understand at the moment. He turned to instruct his subordinates. "Take him back to the Green Bird. Wash him, clean his wounds, change his clothes, and feed him." Having finished with instructing them, Lin Shitang and Gu Tuhao slowly began to rise and accelerated away, flying toward the airship stationed in the sky. The older children had waited on the sidelines for a very long time, watching everything. Although they didn't completely understand what the adults were saying, the talk of being washed, fed, and clothed, they heard these unbelievable, irresistible phrases loud and clear. Seeing the guards about to take Xianxia away, the head of all the older kids charged over, shrieking, "Take me! Take me along! I also want to bathe and eat!" He tried to hug the thighs of the guards and reached out to Xianxia, attempting to pull him out of their embrace. The injured leader pulled roughly at Xianxia's legs, crying out, "That should be my position! Who do you think you are? Everyone get out here and beat this mongrel to death! He actually dared to headbutt me just now! All the food up there should be mine!" The leader was even more vicious than he had previously been, intentionally clawing at Xianxia's injuries. Surviving in the junkyard only had one rule. If you killed someone, you would get everything they had. Resembling mountains, the well-built guards didn't even move and let the leader of the older kids continue raising a ruckus. Seeing that, the little girl quietly began to move over. Only when the leader tried to pull Xianxia so hard that his face was starting to contort with pain did the guard captain coldly say, "That's enough." Even Mr. Tuhao would have nothing to say about this. The moment the guard captain spoke, viciousness flashed across the blank face of the guard that was carrying Xianxia. With a single kick, he brutally punted the older child dozens of meters into the air. This one foot contained a dark, brutal power, and as the leader of the older kids flew into the air, he suddenly exploded into a bloody mist. The other guard merely smiled as he stepped forward, stretching out his leg. He slammed his foot down on the ground, saying, "A pile of puny rats actually dare to disturb the business of Marshal Lin." The ground rippled outward from where he'd slammed his foot down, rapidly spreading. The group of children were thrown into the air by force of the wave, violently spurting blood. Their bones crackled loudly as they distorted into unrecognizable shapes. The wave also rushed right past the captain and the other guards, but they didn't move so much an inch. All of them seemed to have weathered it without being affected. Yet miraculously, the little girl also wasn't hit by the wave. When the captain had spoken, the rest of the other children had been dazed, and some even listened to the leader and stupidly charged Xianxia. The girl had turned and run for her life without looking back. It was in this way that she barely managed to escape the wave, miraculously surviving. Seeing that the little girl had actually managed to escape, the guard's face grew red for a moment. With a loud snort, he lifted his boot to slam it down again. He'd only been using 3/10 of his power. However, the captain suddenly reached out and grabbed the guard's shoulder with his hand, preventing him from slamming his boot down. The captain seemed to be listening to something in his ear, and then he nodded, not moving an inch as he stared at Xianxia with his large eyes. He then brought out his service pistol and put little Xianxia's hands on the trigger. The captain steadied the gun as he aimed it directly at the little girl's chest. He said to Xianxia, "She's already tried to kill you multiple times. Come, pull the trigger, use some force, and then bang. She's dead." With the entirety of his small hands, Xianxia held the trigger gently. He stared at the silhouette of the little girl stumbling and fleeing for her life, knowing that as long as he pulled the trigger, she would definitely sprout blood. He was completely calm as his shiny black eyes watched her. But he shook his head in the end and let go of the trigger. On the airship, Gu Tuhao was all smiles as he said, "Just as I expected. Ha! Lin, old man, it's so rare for you to lose. Come. If you're daring enough to bet, you're daring enough to admit defeat, so hand over that aqua tobacco of yours. It's mine now." Lin Shitong still wore a faint smile on his face. Since the very start, the depths of his eyes were calm as still water. They were so clear and brilliant that they seemed to reflect all of the sights of the world, yet contained nothing. The guards took Xianxia back to the airship. It turned, rose, and vanished into the skyline, merging with the light of the blood moon. As for this particular junkyard and the little girl that was still fleeing for her life, they were forgotten just like that, the same way this continent had been abandoned. Whew. All right. Chapter 3. I think that may be it for me, guys. I have to get ready for the interview with Legion. But this is pretty cool. I liked how they really set up his backstory. A lot of these novels start with people in villages and like, ooh, they are the runt of the village that lost their parents. They're the Batman. Like their parents died. They're orphaned. Either the village hates them or something's going on and they're just really poor and they don't have anyone to count on. This one's a little different in that like the village is not really a village. It's more of a junkyard where everyone's strongest will survive. It's interesting that they bring up the evolutionary tale of the strongest will survive to Lin Shitong and then also have that be strongest will survive in the junkyard. So it's looking like this novel definitely has some of those themes in it where power is like strength is converted to power in terms of what people can do, where only the strong are revered. You know that cliche in Xianxia. So I mean, I'm down. I like it so far. I think it's cool. He's got somebody to back him up. Obviously, he's going to have to learn how to use guns. He's going to have to learn how to use whatever powers that he has. He is probably part of some larger conspiracy where he was probably from the upper regions. These are just predictions because I don't know the novel. I'd say he's probably from the upper regions due to his memories of knowing about the bread, and then through a conspiracy, somebody kidnapped him, ripped out his origin seed, and then threw him in the airship junkyard. And this is where he's been ever since. And he's about 10 years old, so it must have happened when like they said, it was before he was 3. So he probably wouldn't remember too much from then anyway, so it makes sense. Love to hear what you guys' thoughts on it. I'm going to go ahead and call it at 3 chapters. Just because I have to get ready, but I do appreciate everyone who listens to these. Let me know if you have any suggestions. Please rate and comment on iTunes. Give me 5 stars on iTunes and leave a comment. I do read those comments. They mean a lot to me, so I appreciate it. Also, comment on the video. If you have novel suggestions, let me know. If you want to reach out to any translators you know of and say, hey, check out this guy's podcast, you should go on it. More than happy to have people on here before. I love discovering new novels. I love helping you guys discover new novels. And, you know, it's just, I know I haven't been doing them once a week, but, you know, I feel like it's more meaningful when I do them that I'm, like, excited to do them. So I'm going to continue to just kind of release at my own pace, but we will have the interview with Legion going up probably tomorrow, and you'll have these readings, too, to keep you company until then. So thanks so much to everyone who was watching. Obviously, thank you so much to AfterBuzz TV, who taught me everything I know about streaming, setting up a studio, and everything like that. I'm really digging my new studio. If you guys want to support me, you can also support me by following me on Twitter at Stephen Lemieux or at Immortal Index on Twitter. And I started doing gaming streaming. So if any of you guys are interested in like Red Dead Redemption 2, Overwatch, Assassin's Creed, Odyssey, all sorts of stuff like that, I do have a streaming channel on Twitch called AfterBuzz Gaming, and you can check it out on Mixer at AfterBuzz Gaming 2 and on YouTube at youtube.com/AfterBuzzGaming. So with that said, thanks so much to everyone who's watching, and we'll see you for the interview with Legion, who was the translator of this novel. Check it out, guys. Take care.